In the early 1900s, the Great Plains stretched out under spacious skies. Gently rolling hills and fruited plains that ripple west towards the Rocky Mountains. Vast stretches of farmland stirring visions of amber waves of grain, full of promise for those brave enough to build a life there. Now picture a massive cloud of black, growing larger as the winds sweep it across the landscape, seemingly consuming everything in its path.
We had dust storms that were lasting for like several days nonstop, day and night.
Visibility often went down to zero.
Everywhere it goes, this cloud brings sickness, crop failure, and death.
People were getting sick, livestock were dying.
The dust was so thick that people were literally choking on it.
It's not the apocalypse, it's the American Dust Bowl. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie, and you're listening to Off the Radar, a production of the National Weather Desk. On the show, we dig deep into topics about weather, climate, the ocean, space, and much more. Our goal is to help you better understand the weather and to love it as much as we do. The term Dust Bowl might make you think of Woody Guthrie songs or the Joad family in Grapes of Wrath, who left their farm in Oklahoma to search for work in California. The Dust Bowl was exactly what it sounds like, a series of massive dust storms that swept through the southern plains in the United States in the 1930s. Picture gray, black, and red clouds pluming upward and outward like a volcano's eruption, descending on farmsteads and seeming to swallow up the landscape. It's a unique disaster that was equal parts natural disaster and man-made catastrophe. Beginning in 1931, massive droughts choked the southern plains. Over the coming years, winds wore away the topsoil across multiple states, including Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, eastern Colorado, and New Mexico. What was once moisture-rich dirt became a fine dust that choked the air. The dust was sickening to breathe. In the decades before N95 masks, farmers and animals alike were forced to inhale the fine dirt particles. Livestock were found dead in their pastures. Some had 2 inches of dirt lining the insides of their digestive tracts. People would cough up clumps of earth and contract what was commonly called dust pneumonia. The region became practically uninhabitable for the better part of a decade. In one of the largest migrations in American history, 2.5 million people fled the region, many going to California, which held false promises of work and fertile farmland. Today, I'm talking to 2 scientists that have spent decades studying the Dust Bowl. They even co-authored a paper on the topic back in 2015. Dr. Jeff Lee from Texas Tech University and Dr. Thomas Gill from the University of Texas, El Paso will discuss the causes, the impacts, and if this environmental catastrophe could ever happen again. Thank you both for coming and being on the podcast today. I've been wanting to do an episode about the Dust Bowl for a while. I was first drawn to this topic because I read a historical fictional novel about the Dust Bowl, and I realized at the time how little I knew about it.
Which book was that?
It was Four Winds by Kristen Hanna.
I read it a few months ago. It's good.
It is. It's very good. It's, it's kind of sad and depressing, but it was sad and depressing.
Yep.
So,
Depression.
All right. Well, let's hear from both of you. Let's start with you, Jeff, where you are, what your background is, and how you kind of found yourself diving into this subject matter.
Well, I'm a geographer at Texas Tech University in Lubbock in West Texas, near the Dust Bowl, which we'll be talking about. And being here, I wanted to get serious about the Dust Bowl, and I spent about 20 years collecting information. And eventually I realized I needed Tom's help. And together we put together sort of a review paper on why we had such bad dust storms during the 1930s.
Tom, will you give me a little brief background on yourself?
Yeah, I call myself generally an earth scientist. Like Jeff, I'm originally from California and wound up in Texas. When I was in college, First, I studied meteorology and atmospheric science. And then I discovered that my real love was geology. And I was kind of looking for something that connected the two of them. And then I finally, with the help of some great mentors, stumbled upon dust, little pieces of the earth flying around in the air. It's the perfect connection between the atmosphere and the solid earth. And then about 30 years ago, I moved from California after I got my PhD to Lubbock, Texas, which is where I met Jeff. And of course, I realized, Lubbock, Texas, that's the Dust Bowl country. What a great place to continue working on dust. Pretty much as soon as I met Jeff 30 years ago, we started dabbling and chatting about the Dust Bowl, which led to this, really serious collaboration that led to our study that was published, I guess, 10 years ago.
Can you guys give me some background on the Dust Bowl for people who aren't well versed in this part of American history, like where it was, when it was, this time period?
Actually, the term Dust Bowl, some people see it as a drought, and that's all they concentrate on. Some people see the human side of it with the terrible poverty that went on in the 1930s and leading to the migration of many tens of thousands of people to the West Coast, where they found more misery. Hopefully you've read The Grapes of Wrath, one of the great novels of American literature, and that gets into the human side. And there are other books that do it as well. And the third is the Dust Bowl is a piece of the country, part of the Southern Plains, kind of hard to define specifically, but we're mostly talking the Oklahoma Panhandle, the Texas Panhandle, and adjoining parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Kansas.
I guess we can say that the Dust Bowl is also one of the USA's prototypical natural disasters, maybe of a different kind than a hurricane or an earthquake. But people also tend to see it, I think rightly so, as a great natural disaster, maybe one that unfolded and came in and out more slowly than, let's say, or certainly much more slowly than an earthquake or a hurricane, but a disaster it was.
What was the time period? How long did it last?
We're mostly looking at the 1930s, which also gets us into the Great Depression, which contributed, and we can talk about land management of the farmers as well and how that contributed.
Yeah, Tom, you said natural disaster. So what were the natural causes for this drought or Dust Bowl?
Yeah, and that's a good point. Our argument is that the Dust Bowl was not completely a natural disaster, but had human causes. But the natural disaster, there were really two parts of the natural disaster. The biggest one was a drought, a prolonged and extreme to exceptional drought. There's good evidence that in the areas where humans were not farming it, where some of the natural prairie and so on was not disturbed by farming, a severe and prolonged drought will lead to dieback of the native plants. The failure of the rains messes up the growing season, decreases the soil moisture, decreases the land cover, really primes the land to make dust pretty easily. And so that was the natural disaster part of it. And then the effects of the drought in terms of natural disaster were these just horrendous, amazing dust storms of the kind that had not been seen in North America since European settlement and maybe had not been seen since. Jeff may know more about the record in places like Lubbock and Dodge City, but I recently, for another study, had been going back and looking through the dust records here in El Paso, Texas, which is about 300 miles southwest of really the Dust Bowl region. And yet I was looking at some of these dust storms, and even here in El Paso, which was arguably at the very edge of the Dust Bowl, we had dust storms that were lasting for like several days nonstop, day and night. I mean, when we have a dust storm that lasts for more than a couple hours here in West Texas, we start to take it pretty seriously. And, literally there were dust storms that were lasting for days, that had intensities that were not really seen before, and arguably maybe few, if any, time since. The dust originated in that Dust Bowl region of the Great Plains, but in some cases, the dust wound up spreading really across the country. And maybe Jeff can mention a little bit about that, about how bad and how extreme the dust was and how far it went.
Yeah, I had a student many years ago who told me that a neighbor of his was a janitor here at Texas Tech in Lubbock during the 1930s. And he said after these horrendous dust storms, to clean up the hallways in the buildings, they would use shovels. Gives you some idea of how much material was moving around. And people were breathing this in, people were getting sick, livestock were dying just from inhaling too much dust. There were respiratory diseases that came out of it. It was just a really rough time. Now we have a dust storm and we complain about it, but it is so trivial compared to what was going on in the 1930s. And we should point out there have always been dust storms on the Great Plains, and there probably always will be, but the 1930s was just so much worse, we think, than any other time.
You have the drought and then you have the dust storms. What caused the dust storms? Can you explain a little bit more atmospherically what's going on there, and then how it's different from a haboob? Because we hear about haboobs and we see them in videos now. What's the difference?
That's a good point. I mean, of course, you have to have more than just drought and dryness to create a dust storm. You have to have wind. And wind on the plains, it, comes in several varieties of windstorms. We have the typically more summertime thunderstorms that provide nowadays these dramatic haboob type walls of dust. But what really creates the big, long-lasting dust storms are cyclones, or low pressure systems that atmospheric scientists would call them, as well as fronts, typically cold fronts. We get, especially in the cool, dry season from late fall through spring, typically there are what we call lee cyclones, or very strong cyclones or storms that form kind of at the edge of the Dust Bowl region, just southeast of the Rocky Mountains, and move west to east with very, very strong cold fronts that have very, very strong winds. A lot of times cold fronts also come down from the north to south. And I was just going back through the evidence, and these are the storms that also cause a lot of the more dramatic and consequential dust storms nowadays. There seems to be some evidence that these cyclones and cold fronts were more frequent and maybe had higher winds during the Dust Bowl period of the 1930s than today. And I'm not sure why, and I'm not sure. That's kind of, I think, an unresolved part of the story. But strong wind plus dry, loose soil gives you dust. Now, really an indication to us of the intensity of the dust storms. Normally, you have to have really, really strong localized winds, such as from a thunderstorm, to get a haboob, this gigantic wall of dust coming across the land. But in the most intense cold fronts, most intense cold fronts that are accelerating very strongly, you can also get haboobs. And that certainly happened during the 1930s in the plains, in the Dust Bowl, as evidence from many postcards and photographs that are iconic now of that period.
Okay, so we have the drought, we have the weather pattern set up. What about farming practices? Jeff, maybe you can touch upon this. What was going on with these farms that contributed?
First of all, this whole area wasn't farmed until into the 20th century. There was a whole lot of land that was mostly used for grazing. But World War I came along. Europe couldn't grow their own food, so the price of wheat skyrocketed, and that brought a whole lot of people out here where they could get cheap land and start farming. And in the teens and 20s, it was pretty wet out here. We went through an unusually wet period, so they were doing great. This is long before irrigation started. They had to rely completely on rainfall. But as long as you've got a wet year, you can do well. We transitioned out of mules pulling plows, and so most farmers had tractors by the late 20s and into the 30s, which also meant they had debt because those are expensive. The idea of farming in a fairly dry area is generally called dryland farming. And the most important thing farmers are doing is trying to keep water down where the roots of the plants are. And ways were developed to do that, but the way to keep the soil moisture from evaporating was to put what they called a layer of dust mulch, fine material on the surface, which prevented the capillary rise of the soil moisture and kept it wetter down below. But when you're not protecting the soil with plants, which happens with a drought, that loose material is very easy for the wind to pick up. And then now you've got yourself some dust storms, much worse than would have happened otherwise. And over time, farmers learned ways to improve it, but they couldn't. The other factor we haven't really brought in is the Great Depression, which started in 1929, went through the 1930s. And, nationally, there were times of 25% unemployment. Crop prices went way down. So not only was there a drought and they couldn't raise as much, it was mostly wheat in that region, but they couldn't raise as much, and what they could harvest, they got a lot less money for. So financially, they were in difficult times. Again, they had mortgages paying off farm equipment, tractors and other things. There were things they could do to reduce the amount of erosion, plowing up in a certain way, and they learned more through the 30s, but that costs money. You have to have gas for your tractor and so on, and it just became very difficult. So a lot of land went bare. They couldn't keep a crop on it. A fair amount of land got abandoned, those people who took off for California. And so there was a whole lot of unprotected land, all of which leads to these dust storms.
And also, too, with the depression and the economic crash, if you take out big loans on your fancy new tractor, which allows you to plow and farm larger acreage, and then you can't make payments and your tractor gets repossessed, all of a sudden you can't really deal with your land anymore. And the land winds up getting barren and not properly plowed or taken care of. And then I think in many cases became more prone to erosion, because now suddenly the farmers didn't have the tools in some cases to manage their land to reduce erosion, like Jeff said, because, their tractors were repossessed, if not the land itself.
Were there any other factors that played in here, either direct or indirect?
The 1930s were also the time of the New Deal. And one of the things that Franklin Roosevelt and his folks wanted to do was to help farmers, especially in this area. Wind erosion is very dramatic. You can take pictures of it. There were times when dust storms starting in the Dust Bowl, the dust was very obvious on the East Coast. There's a story of the head of the Soil Conservation Service, Hugh Hammond Bennett. He wanted more government support to protect the soils, and he knew he was scheduled to testify in Congress to try to get this happening. And he saw the weather report and knew that a dust storm was approaching Washington, D.C. So he took all the tricks he could figure out to delay his testimony until when he started, the dust started filtering into the Capitol and he could make his point much more dramatically. That helped to get things going. The federal government got involved. There was a lot of research on the best way to farm, and a lot of that was, how do we protect the soil? And the government set up demonstration farms, and they would bring farmers in and say, if you do it this way, we think things will be better. That all made a big impact. It didn't stop the storms, but we think it helped a lot. And then as by the end of the 30s, the rainfall returned. By 1940, there was good rainfall. World War II was getting started in the late 1930s, in Europe anyway. And once again, crop prices went up. And so farmers had better crops and they could sell it for more money. So things improved dramatically as you go into the 1940s.
Maybe once again able to afford that equipment that helped them take care of their land as well, too.
Right.
Well, let's talk about the impact to people and what this did to not just the human body, but as far as like people fleeing to California. Why California, for one? And then what was it doing to them? Why were they leaving?
Well, they were leaving because they couldn't feed themselves. Malnutrition was an issue. Farmers try their hardest to keep their land going and hope next year is going to be better. But at some point, you have to give up. There was a lot of advertising about how plentiful jobs were in California and Oregon and other places, most of which was not true. They were treated horribly in many cases. Again, read The Grapes of Wrath or a number of other books, the fictional versions. Watch the Ken Burns documentary on the Dust Bowl. Highly recommend that. Again, it was something we don't see in the United States and haven't for many, many decades. And we need to realize how fortunate we are.
And this is just speculation maybe from me. And I think there's some evidence that, a lot of the people who settled in the Dust Bowl region previously had come from points east and kind of maybe symbolically or in their minds had kind of given up on the East. And from the Dust Bowl region, a lot of the roads and highways of the time naturally go to the West. And as Jeff said, there was, I guess you could say, propaganda coming saying, hey, California is the land of endless sunshine and the farmland is great. And, it's the land of opportunity. And so I think there was and there's another, like a lot of the Dust Bowl migrants from the Dust Bowl area wound up in the Central Valley of California, which is another large plains area with maybe similar climate and similar opportunities for agriculture. And I think it was just an attraction to keep going west.
Makes sense. What about long-term impacts of breathing in dust?
Well, at the time of the Dust Bowl, there was a term that was coined called dust pneumonia. The dust was so thick that people were literally choking on it. The medical reports and literature was not as good then as it is now. And the medical literature is sketchy, but there are reports of people just practically choking from too much of their respiratory system, having too much dust in it, pneumonia or bronchitis-like diseases that people were getting related from the dust inhalation, just literally from an acute overload of the dust. And that certainly happened. And there were physicians who were trying to find ways to treat people of it. But then I think after the Dust Bowl, the medical community kind of forgot about effects of dust on health. Really was not really considered that much of a problem. I mean, even up until not that long ago, it was generally thought even by regulators. Well, dust is a natural substance. It's soil. The particles are much larger compared to a particle of like smoke or pollution coming out of a car. So it's not really likely to hurt you. I mean, I went to scientific conferences about 20 years ago where there were supposed experts saying, we should do away with this concept that breathing dust is unhealthy. And I'd say there's been a real change in the past 10 to 20 years where scientists and also the biomedical and epidemiological community has realized that breathing too much dust is unhealthy. Yes, most particles of dust are larger than the sizes of the tiny particles that come out of a smokestack or the tailpipe of a car. But still, breathing in too much dust it irritates the respiratory tract. We do know now that in most cases, there are plenty enough of very, very fine small particles, especially in big dust storms, that can get deep into your respiratory tract, get deep into your lungs, cause inflammation, sometimes are carrying toxic materials or viruses or fungi or things like that. So now the evidence has become very clear with a lot of renewed emphasis in the past decade or two on health-related studies of dust, that it does pose a human health effect. And it's not something that we can just ignore because it's, coming out of the natural ground rather than out of a car's tailpipe. And inhaling too much dust can lead to both acute and chronic effects. There's a lot of studies, including here in the Southwest US, showing a connection of dust to things, especially such as asthma and other respiratory diseases, especially in children and the elderly. But we also know there's so many studies that show a clear connection. Maybe the exact mechanisms haven't always been worked out yet, but statistically and epidemiologically, there's a clear connection between inhaling too much particulate matter in the form of dust and cardiovascular diseases and even neurodegenerative diseases. The more we look into it, the more we find connections between breathing too much dust and really a wide variety of health problems.
There's a fair amount of similarity between what Tom's talking about and black lung disease from coal miners breathing in so much coal dust and rock dust. We're talking about breathing it in, but visibility often went down to zero. And people would string a rope between their barn and their house so they could find their way back into the house. People talked about when you set the table for dinner, you had to leave the plates upside down so they weren't covered in dust before the food got put on them. Many kids had to sleep with sheets over their heads just to reduce the amount that they were breathing in.
All right, so it's been almost 100 years. In that 100-year period, have you seen any drought comparable to this and it just didn't have the same impact? Has this happened since then?
In the 1950s, there was a drought, mostly here in West Texas, that was more extreme than what happened in the 1930s. And there were big dust storms, but farmers knew more and the economy was strong. So the effects of that drought were far less, way less than what was happening in the 1930s. And now when we have droughts, there tends to be more dust than during wetter years. Because again, we're still having dust storms out here and they fluctuate year to year. But they're orders of magnitude less intense than what we were seeing.
I mean, there's a lot of talk that the Southwest is in sort of a continuing or incipient mega drought since the early part of the 21st century. And that brings back to me the one thing that I'm concerned about. If you look at the paleoclimatic record going back into the past, much longer than 100 years, going back, you can actually use the record from tree rings to look at the impact and other proxy, what we call proxy data, scientific and historical evidence of drought going back hundreds, several thousand years at least in the Southwest. And what concerns me is over the past millennium, there have been about 4 or so periods of real, I guess I'll call them super mega droughts, that would put anything that the region experienced in the 1930s or the 1950s to shame. I mean, essentially little or no rain for decades on end. And these mega droughts have happened, and they have had absolute civilizational impacts on the indigenous people who were living here at the time and on the land. There's no reason not to think that another mega drought couldn't happen anytime. And by mega drought, I'm talking about, a drought that was worse than the 1930s or the 1950s, maybe lasting for 20, 30, 50 years or the better part of a century. And that's what really scares me. What would happen if we had another one of those real mega droughts?
It sounds like such a huge portion of this was what was going on economically and with the people. So if that did happen, what do you see as the outcome? Would it be as devastating, or would we be better prepared for it?
Well, like Jeff said, even like a few decades later in the 1950s, farmers and land managers had learned enough the lessons from the 1930s Dust Bowl that the 1950s drought, even though I think by pretty much any objective, the drought itself was worse in the 50s than the 30s, but the dust wasn't. But if you have a drought that lasts for 30, 50, 100 years, that's going to cause such large-scale disruption. It would be a real challenge as a nation, as an economy, to deal with that. And, I'm not a historian and I'm not a demographer. And so I don't know what kind of population and cultural shifts there would be, but I can imagine that it would be not good, and it might be very hard to take care of the land, at least for a while.
And a whole other topic to bring into this is this whole Dust Bowl region and elsewhere relies on what's called the Ogallala Aquifer. And since, let's say, the 1960s, there's been an awful lot of irrigation from that groundwater, which has made farming, more expensive to do, but also more reliable. You're not relying on just rainfall. But we're running out of that. And for decades, people have been saying we're about to run out of water, or it won't be economical to pump water. It's finally happening. And so we have places not far from Lubbock where irrigated farming has to be stopped. And the big question is, what are they going to do with their land? And it looks like, at least for now, many of them are going back to this dry land farming, which has been going on. Not every acre is irrigated. But as we lose that, are they going to go to this dry land farming and continue that for a long time? Wind energy keeps moving into the region. If landowners can at least get a few windmills on their property, that gives them a check every month. And so there are a whole lot of unknowns of what's going to happen in the future.
I'm curious, too, because I want to touch upon weather modification, and if either one of you is well-versed in that, and if you think that is a possible way of mitigating a potential future disaster like this.
I'm skeptical. I mean, most of the things I've seen give me more worries than confidence. And I mean, I think the Dust Bowl itself and how European American farmers came in, basically started treating the land in a way that they thought was appropriate because it was based on farming that worked in other places. And what they didn't know at the time was that it wasn't really appropriate for a semi-arid area like the plains. Certainly contributed to the disaster. And it's like the old saying, don't mess with Mother Nature. There are things like a certain amount of small-scale weather modification, like cloud seeding that goes on. I think it still goes on in the plains, but I don't think it's going to be a big solution.
Yeah, I haven't seen solid evidence that it really works. Then there's the whole climate change part, and some areas are supposed to get wetter and some areas are supposed to get drier. And I don't think anybody has a clue what's going to happen here.
Yeah, I don't think we have great confidence. The models and the predictions generally say and point to increased drying in the plains and in the surrounding areas with the warming of the climate. And, in general, drying is associated with drought, and we know that drought is associated with some of the extreme dust periods. But then there's also some paleoclimatic evidence that suggested during some of these mega droughts, there may not have been that much dust because there wasn't really that much wind or as many windstorms. So I don't think we can say with a lot of certainty what climate change is going to mean for dust in the region. But it's certainly possible that it could make the conditions leading to dust storms worse, especially if drought becomes more frequent and more intense. And I think we certainly need to be prepared for that, very strong possibility, although it's not certain, that climate change is going to lead to more drought and potentially more dusty conditions. It would be foolish not to.
Yeah, I've been asked a few times, can it get as bad as it was in the 1930s? And just my gut tells me probably not. We know so much more. We have much better technology to deal with it. Farmers know what they're doing. I still don't think it will get as bad. Now, you get to the point of civilization collapsing and then all bets are off. But I think for any reasonable projection of what's going on in the future, it shouldn't be as bad. It can get worse than it is now, but probably not to the scale it was in the 1930s.
Is it still important, though, to keep remembering, keep studying, keep learning about what happens so that we can make sure it doesn't happen again?
Absolutely. That's why we keep studying this stuff.
I mean, we know a lot more now than we did 100 years ago or even decades ago that dust is not just a nuisance, that it has real impacts to society. Even at levels far, far below the Dust Bowl, we know that it has economic impacts on transportation, and of course, impacts on health. There was a study that I was part of that came out earlier this year that calculated the economic impact of dust on the United States. Dust and related wind erosion was over $100 billion per year. It was in the realm of things like tornadoes and hurricanes and other natural disasters. By the time you add up all of its effects, we have to pay mind to it.
Jeff, Tom, is there anything else you want to add about the Dust Bowl?
It's often referred to as the biggest environmental disaster in U.S. history. We have learned a lot from it. It doesn't always mean we follow those lessons.
There were some obvious mistakes that helped make the Dust Bowl as bad as it was. But there were some great lessons learned and some really great understandings about why dust happens and wind erosion and how we can manage it. And I just really hope that we always pay attention to heeding those lessons, because we know that there will be droughts in the future. There will be bad droughts in the future. There will be economic recessions and depressions in the future. And if the United States has the misfortune of having an extreme drought and an economic depression hitting at the same time as it did almost 100 years ago, I sure hope that we'll remember those lessons so the impacts won't be as bad.
Our big lesson from the work that we did on this was it wasn't just a drought that caused it. It wasn't just what the farmers were doing. It wasn't just the economy. It was all three of those coming together in just the wrong time that made it so horrendous in this part of the country.
And I hope that doesn't happen for a long, long time in the future.
Well, Jeff, Tom, thank you so much for your time today. This was very interesting.
Thank you, Emily.
Off the Radar is a production of the National Weather Desk. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes publish every Tuesday. Also, please rate and review the podcast on Spotify and Apple. Let us know what you think of the show and give us ideas for new episodes. Thank you to Jeff Lee and Tom Gill for joining me today to talk about this dark time in American history. Thanks to the National Weather Desk and Sinclair Broadcast Group for their ongoing support of the podcast. And as always, my associate producer, Brian Petras, for his help with today's episode. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie. Make it a great day.